Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good to see you here. So this panel is about, well, one of the most, I would say, interesting questions that, at least for me, how we will see academia after or during generative AI advancements. And we'll talk about that from various perspectives. We will share different point of views from different types of issues that arise from generative AI. But first, before we begin the discussion, I would like to say that I want to acknowledge Tal Jarsky, which you might see in the photo, who was the driving force behind this panel, and ironically, he couldn't make it. He was supposed to moderate this session. I was supposed to be a speaker, but I'm stepping in instead of him, and I'll moderate the discussion, and I'll give some of my own points before we go to our various speakers. So generally, what we want to do here, each of the panelists will talk about roughly 10 minutes to share their own views about how generative AI will or could reshape academia and the various aspects that go with it. And then we will raise some further questions to discuss it, and we will open up the floor. This is supposed to be a discussion with you as well, not just us talking. I'll just share my personal experience a bit. I will say that, first of all, I'm a law professor, but I'm more of a techie than a legal scholar, I would say, in the sense that I really like the technology. And 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, when ChatGPT was first out there, I toyed with it a lot, and I'm still playing with all the different models a lot. And it took a while until I figured out, for me at least, what works and what doesn't. And I think that a lot of people have barriers to use generative AI or to use it in a way that is beneficial for them. A lot of people get the mistakes, the errors, the hallucinations, all the different types of problems that we get in generative AI, and sometimes they just let it go. I had a lot of discussions about academic use in various universities and institutions around the world, and many times I received a lot of backlash about the use of generative AI, just the use in general. So a lot of institutions for now still say students can't use it, for example, or they're not allowed to, or maybe they're allowed just a little bit. And I think there's a lot of things to discuss there. How should we adapt to it as those who try to, for me at least, to try to teach students how to use it, to teach future lawyers how to use it? Should we just forsake it and say, like, don't use it, don't touch it, just do the traditional way? Or should they adapt? And I think that's a very important discussion to have. And for that, I would like to raise for a thought experiment first. So what if we had a button that you can press, and by the press of the button, you get everything done, let's say, as a lawyer, okay? Let's say as a scholar. Let's say that it generates the perfect article, the perfect book with citations, without hallucinations, without anything. Okay, now we pressed it. Where does academia stand at that point? Do we actually need research as we conduct it today, or at least the way that we do it? Do we need to actually have, PhD students at the same level, in the same way that we tutor them, or LLM students, or master students, or bachelor students even? What about education? What if by a press of a button, I can actually make a student learn much faster, better, and not, we teach for almost 4 years at law school. Maybe now it could take 6 months. Maybe it could take a month. Do we actually need to preserve this, institution the way that it is today? So I think that, first of all, we don't have that button yet, right? If you've experimented with generative AI, I think it's a great tool. I'm not talking about a specific model right now, but just generally, it's for me at least, it reduces a lot of time, a lot of things that I used to do and took me a lot of time and effort, I don't have to do anymore. I think it really helps me in the brainstorming phase. It really helps me in reviewing a lot of things about what I write and research in various tasks that I give it to do. And there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think it really helps me to become a better scholar that can actually take more of its free time, if we have that, and in that time, conduct more research. So I don't have that button yet, but I think the question is, how do we go from where we're at right now, which is we have very great tools which are advancing in a rapid pace, to a point by which maybe that button will exist and maybe it won't take that long, and then we will have to restructure or rethink the entire, institutional organization. So one of the things that I want to discuss mainly, or not mainly, but some parts of this panel is, what is this technology about to do to our institutions? From teaching to researching to anything that relates to that. And within that, we have a lot of problems that we want to discuss. We have to discuss. I know there are other panels, a lot of panels about generative AI here. Some of them actually have to do with data protection, which I think is the main theme of this conference. But some of them have to do with IP, which we're not touching upon here, as our title suggests. But there are other things that we need to discuss, all the problems, all the hallucinations, all the errors. What does it do to research, to actual research? What does it do to thinking? Maybe it's not a good tool to use because we're not thinking anymore. We have a machine who's thinking for us. Maybe it, maybe even if it doesn't hallucinate, but when you ask it, give me a paper about bias, for example, and bias is also one of the main issues, maybe it will repeat the same research all over again, and then we haven't done real research. We haven't actually picked up and read the papers, and we're just feeding the machine with a lot of things, which it will keep spitting out the same research, and that will actually harm our intellectual innovation and generally our jobs as scholars. So these are part of the issues which I think about, at least when I try to do that in my own university, try to understand whether or not I should implement and how I should do that. Just to exemplify, I lead our LLM for law and technology lawyers. They come to us and they wanna know how to use it. They don't want not to use it. They want to know how to actually embed that in their work. They want to know how to make better contracts faster and not use as many interns maybe, or maybe lower level lawyers that they would have before generative AI. They want to be better at that, and they want to use it better. And I, as an institution, as someone who represents the institution, I have to try to find a way to make them better lawyers with all the problems that we have with generative AI. So these are the things that I'm just throwing out for our speakers, and I will introduce them one by one shortly. You have their full bio within the program, so you can write. So our first speaker is Natalie Samoa, a legal scholar and philosopher currently at KU Leuven. Her work focuses on the ethical and legal implications of digital technologies, particularly their impact on human rights and the rule of law. She has held academic positions at NYU, Columbia, Oxford, and the University of Chicago, and previously worked within the European Commission on AI policy. And she's the recent author of Algorithmic Rule by Law by COP. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I was very happy to accept the invitation for this panel because it's, I think, a fascinating topic for everyone in academia and also beyond. So maybe some observations. I mean, we all know that the interfaces of generative AI are made for non-experts to make use of them. And that is why today, millions, if not billions of people are using all sorts of generative AI tools, although most people use a small concentration of tools. All right, there are not yet a million of generative AI tools that are being used, so we tend to use the same ones. And it's sometimes also seen as a kind of calculator, right? We used to have to do maths by head, you say in Flemish. I don't think you say that in English, but you'd have to do it in your head. Then calculators came, and so these more complicated things that you wouldn't really need to do, wouldn't really need to know in order to function in the world, you could outsource to a calculator. And so some people see generative AI tools as a similar thing, right? All the things that are maybe more banal or take a bit of more time that you wouldn't otherwise need to do, you can outsource now. So a kind of super calculator in a way. And I'm the first one in the panel. I'll probably be one of the more critical ones because I want to argue that I don't think this calculator analogy works at all. I think something much more fundamental is at stake. We delegate all kinds of tasks to generative AI nowadays, and some of these tasks are very banal, like drafting an email to someone. Some of these tasks ask for a bit more creativity, especially in academia, right? Think of academic writing, whether it's a professor or a PhD student that is brainstorming or that is looking to polish certain language of their academic paper, or whether it's a student that has a task of writing an essay and outsources some of the thinking or the drafting or at least the polishing to an AI system. And I think there are many issues that we can talk about if we talk about the legal and ethical risks, and Eldar already mentioned a few of them. I think the risk of having facts presented to you as objectively, even though they're completely made up, is a big one if we are in the spirit of academia and objective truth that we're trying to find, if that exists. The privacy-related risks, which maybe some other people will mention. I just want to focus on one issue in particular in the minutes I have, and that is the issue of thinking and judgment, because I think there is an inherent link between writing or the use of language and between thinking. So that's what I want to focus on, because in every case that we make use of these kind of systems, even if it's for banal tasks like drafting an email to a student, we are in a way delegating how we express ourselves. And that is something that we are not always aware of when we're making use of the technology. And this is where the analogy with the calculator doesn't really make sense, because the way we express ourselves, the way we write, also reflects the way we think, and that is an inherently human capacity, something that makes us unique, and that is really not the same as using a calculator to have a calculation going. But before I go overly into the cautionary approach, let me point out some of the positives that I see for academic users. So first of all, it can be a tool that improves the way we communicate with each other. We don't always find the right words when we want to communicate with colleagues, with students, with fellow professors. With generative AI, you can have your sentences, your emails polished, and that can help in communication, right? It can help us with our language skills. So in academia, especially if you want to make an international impact, you're still supposed to write in English. And native speakers have such a huge advantage, right? Especially in the humanities, but everywhere else as well, I would argue. So in a way, with generative AI, you could see it as a kind of democratizing tool, right? To make the beautiful English sentences available to everyone. I'll say a bit more about that. It could also help people participate in discussion, academic debate, even political debate, going beyond academia. People who might not feel comfortable with the way they express themselves in English or in general might find the right words to actually participate in the debate if they make use of an AI system to polish their language. And more generally, it can make research, faster. It makes the production process of drafting academic papers faster. But I want to go back to the drafting issue, because again, each time we make use of these tools to draft, we are in a way expressing our thoughts through the language that the system is giving to us. And the way we express our thoughts is something that we uniquely do in our own way. We each kind of have our own voice. And maybe some voices are more grammatically error-free than others, but it's still your own voice. And especially in academia, this is a very important thing. And I'm not just talking about academics producing content like professors, but I think also for students, it's very important that they learn to find and use their own voice, even if it makes mistakes, even if it's not the most beautiful English in the world, because it's the way they express their own thoughts. It's their thoughts, not someone else's thoughts, or at least that's what we want them to learn. And so there is a clear link to thinking, right? There's lots of studies that have been done over the centuries already about the link between language and thought. We think in language, right? Also in our head, when we don't put it on a piece of paper, we use language to think. And we all acknowledge this link between language and thought, for instance, when we insist on inclusive language, for instance, right? Why do we insist on also saying she rather than only he? It's It's because we think that the way in which we use language also has an impact on our thought and about society. The way we use language reflects our individual reflection, but also societal reflection. Narratives are very important for society at large. If we want to change the world, we change language. So this is a very important link between language and thought. So the delegation of writing is in a way also a delegation of thinking, whether it's for banal thoughts or for more complex thoughts. And because AI systems, don't just come falling from the sky as autonomous things, in a way, we're not just delegating the way we think to a system, we're delegating it to developers of the system, right? To the choices, the normatively laden choices that they make when they design the system. And again, this can be good or bad, but it's important to be aware of the fact that it's shaped by other people, and these people might have agendas. And we already have had examples of, DeepSeek is not going to tell you much about the Tiananmen Square, but also, more Western AI tools might have specific biases, and these can be deliberately programmed. We've had some examples of that recently, but they can also be negligently programmed, right, by negligent collection and training of the data. And this can hence influence us in a way that we're not even realizing. And people are going to say, well, if you're only using it to edit a sentence here and there, are you really at risk of delegating your thoughts to OpenAI, right? This is, I think, a good counter argument that you can make. But the thing is that the more you're using it, even just for editing sentences, the more there is a risk, at least for some people, that they're going to rely on it more and more. So even I myself, so I do research on this stuff. So I do research on the ethical risks, right? But even myself, when I use the system to polish a sentence, more and more I realize that it's the threshold to not use it becomes higher. Because if I can just, with the click of a button, always have beautiful sentences, I become more uncertain about my English sentences, about my language use. And it just becomes normalized. And I am talking about myself, but this is also the experience I've had from many, many people, English speakers, but especially also non-native speakers who become actually more uncertain about their language use because of the use of ChatGPT, for instance. They just keep on going back to it for ever more things. So I do think there is a little bit of a risk of a function creep and normalization that comes with it. So this is why I insist so much on the link between thought and language. I even get emails from students that they forget to edit, which says, here's an email you could use. Let me know if you want more. Full copy-paste, right? So basically mindless copy-pasting. And we shouldn't be too surprised about that, because in the newspapers, I read articles like, here are 5 ways in which you can use ChatGPT to summarize all your class materials and study better. So we also risk going towards an academic context where both researchers who frankly don't have much time to read with all the commitments you have, and students who feel like they don't have time for their assignments are going to make summaries of the text that they read. They're going to make summaries of the emails that the professor sent them, and we're all just going to read each other's summaries rather than truly engaging with our work. So here's the caveat to it can help with communication. Sure, but it all depends on the way you use it, right? And so that's then the main argument I get. Natalie, just relax. It all depends on how you use it. If I'm only using it for editing sentences, everything is fine. Now, the big problem is human laziness, right? We are quite lazy inherently. We are quite insecure inherently, and these are not things that the law can change, right? It's something that is inherently part of us. And the technology, whether we want it or not, serves as a tool to kind of enhance that laziness. So the first risk I see here is that we're going to go towards an erosion of skills, which is not just the skill of using language, right, and expressing our thoughts. It's also the skill of critical thinking more generally. Right? And this is an argument that has been made also with other technologies, right? Oh, we're all watching TV mindlessly and not thinking anymore. But I do think that with generative AI, it goes a step forward, especially in academia, right? Because you are more and more relying on someone else, some other entity, shaping your thoughts for you. And even if you say, yes, but I made the prompt, right? And I'm thinking hard about my prompt, I mean, let's be honest, right? Everyone who experimented with it, yes, you can start with a prompt, but soon they will actually be able to prompt even better for you than what you had in mind originally. So the first threat I see there is this erosion of skill. And in the last minutes I have, I want to link it to democracy. Democracy only functions if you have people who are able to think critically. In order to think critically, you need to be able to express your thoughts in language, whether it's in your head or on a piece of paper. And academia, par excellence, plays a crucial role when it comes to democratic societies, right? Sometimes they're seen as kind of the fourth power that hold people to account through their research. So there's a true danger there. And this is, of course, worst case scenario, right? I'm not saying that today democracy is completely at risk because of this erosion of skills and erosion of thinking, but I do think it's something we need to keep in mind. So on the one hand, there is our own human laziness. On the other hand, there is a risk that powerful entities, whether it's the private companies developing the systems or states controlling the systems, that they can, to some extent, manipulate the design of the systems in a way that our critical thinking is also shaped ideologically towards what they're looking for, even in manners that we're not aware of. And then a final thing I'll say, and then I promise I'll stop. I'm very passionate about it. I think we also need to see the difference between generations. Right? I think it's very different for you, Eldar, to make use of these tools, having been trained for years to do it without the tool, versus our students who are still learning very, very basic skills. So I think we need to think really hard in academia about what are the skills that we truly need to learn first before we can start outsourcing a little bit and under which conditions to these tools. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the last point, I would say that I had a lot of meeting with law firms, and many of them say the same thing. Many of them say it's not that we fear that we will lose our jobs, because we already have a legal mind. We already know how to do that. And when we use it, we do think that lawyers that will not use that will lose their jobs. However, we fear for the interns that come in, and we fear for the junior associates, which if they don't have that legal capacity of years of training, then generative AI is not good enough, at least in the point that it is right now. So we don't need that level for now. And a lot of them keep saying that in the sense of what we are trying to do, or I'm trying to do with my students, is we still need them to think like lawyers or to learn how to think legally before they delegate powers to ChatGPT or whatever. We'll get back to that. Thank you. Our next speaker is Paula Stipierre. She's the Director of Data Ethics and Innovation in ADA Learning. With over a decade of experience at the intersection of data protection, ethics, and technology, she brings deep expertise in shaping responsible digital innovation. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And before I sort of like delve into my contribution to this panel, which is mainly on the regulatory side, perhaps also on a personal note, I used to be in academia, then transitioned to the private sector. And when I was still in academia, I was also teaching. And I remember, so this was maybe 10 years ago, and obviously students were resourceful then already at sort of like finding their way around assignments. But I want to say they were still reasonably good at reading. I think like one concern that I do have, also talking to friends who work in academia, who work with sort of like students who are now 18 or 19, is the concentration span and like the sort of like amount of assignments you can actually hand over, because everything has to be broken down in these small digestible bits, right? Maybe they don't read it because they only read the summary. So I think that's also like one sort of like aspect of like just training, thinking, like being able to engage with complex arguments, being able to actually like hold through the attention span through like an entire book. I think this is also becoming a real issue and a problem, because I think it's fine to build upon those skills and then make life easier in certain aspects, but you need to build those skills first. And I think university has a critical role to play to still encourage students to engage with the source material, because Spark Notes are not going to give you the same experience. And if you're in the legal field as well, I cannot delegate reading the AI Act, unfortunately, to ChatGPT, right? Because otherwise I will not understand the nuance of it. I will not be able to engage with it. So that's also, I think, a skill that we need to preserve. Speaking of the AI Act, however, like one aspect of the use of AI in universities that we should also not neglect, which, however, I don't think is at the sort of like a level of awareness that it probably should be at this point, is that the AI Act also applies to universities as institutions, and in fact, the use of AI in those institutions could fall into the high-risk category. So whenever you use an AI system for the purpose of admitting somebody to university, evaluating their work, right? So essentially taking decisions about their trajectory in a university context, you will fall into the high-risk category under the AI Act, which also means that universities as institutions would theoretically have to invest in good data governance, quality management, risk management systems, so a whole range of complex sort of like software engineering best practices that a university may or may not be equipped to handle. And obviously professors are also experimenting with these tools, right? May want to have a shortcut to grading students, which I get because I also used to grade a lot of papers. It's not so fun either. But this could sort of like accidentally bring a university as an institution into the high-risk category. And so this is also made me at least think about what kind of skills we actually need to foster in an academic environment to handle that aspect of AI systems. And then inevitably, the AI Act is not the only law governing AI systems. I mean, we are still at a data protection conference, even though it's now CPDP.ai. And inevitably, the GDPR is actually maybe still one of the biggest laws governing AI systems, at least in Europe, right? It's also like what I tell companies that I sort of like advise in this field, like, you probably don't have to worry that much about the AI, but the GDPR will probably be a problem. Because you inevitably need to be careful about what kind of data you can enter into AI systems for what purposes. Obviously, a lot of people just use the free version of the software. Then you just have to be aware that the data will be used to train things. There have been numerous instances where random personal data like pops up on somebody else's device based on some like completely unrelated request. So I think we're also at risk of losing control over the kind of data being processed in these systems and at what cost. And the cost issue is real as well, of course, because inevitably a lot of us use the free version because it's very expensive to use the enterprise version. I work at a small German startup. We have these debates as well as to what kind of investment we can actually make. But if you don't invest in the enterprise version, then you cannot basically process personal data, customer data, financial related data, at least not securely. And I think we're also seeing sovereignty debates pop up again around transatlantic data flows, the extent to which the European ecosystem can keep up and also provide maybe like context-specific alternatives. So I think there's a lot of concerns to think about on the like legal side as well, the ethical side inevitably. But on the plus side, I think that also leaves a lot of room for innovation, particularly at universities who could actually think about developing tools as well that are appropriate to that context, because I think that's the direction we'll be heading to from a technological side, where you move away perhaps from these like complete general purpose AI systems to very context specifically trained AI systems that can be securely used in those environments as well. And I already know, for instance, like projects at TU Munich, where the software engineering department there is investing in tools that are supposed to facilitate learning for students that are basically trained in that specific context. So maybe that's a nice engineering challenge to take away for the universities too.
Thank you so much. And our third speaker is Courtney Baumann. He's the Global Director of Privacy and Civil Liberties Engineering at Palantir Technologies, and he leads initiatives to ensure that Palantir's platforms will uphold privacy, security, and ethical standards, working closely with the government and commercial partners. So we have some of the industry perspective a bit about generative AI in academia.
Yeah,
The floor is yours.
so it's a pleasure to be here and to follow a couple of excellent parts of the discussion. And I will try to be relatively quick because I'm more interested in some of the dialogue than hearing myself speak. It is a bit odd that I'm here as an industry representative, but I want to try and make an argument about why there needs to be some version of a perspective in academic discussions from industry. And I should preface that by saying, yes, nominally I'm an industry representative. Yes, nominally I work for an AI company, but in some ways I'm probably as skeptical, maybe more skeptical of the technology. And I think that's an important aspect of how industry has to grapple with the issues surrounding the adoption and use of artificial intelligence and more generally frontier technologies. So what am I doing here, and why do I think the industry perspective actually matters or is important to this discussion? One, I think the perspectives that industry can offer are actually critical for understanding what's real and what's not real about the general adoption of technology. And this is a point that Paula alluded to in her references to the Academy's obligations under regulations like GDPR and the downstream implications of using the technology according to the regulatory requirements. But there's a second point here, which is acknowledging that not all students will end up becoming academics and will stay in the academy. Most students will, in fact, go out into the broader world and become the next workers, the next generation of labor that are using these technologies, and they need to be appropriately prepared for the challenges that come along with the use of artificial intelligence. So if I may be slightly provocative, I want to suggest that in some ways the academy is maybe the worst environment or the worst laboratory for the adoption of artificial intelligence technologies. And that is because we often think of the academy as a kind of sacrosanct space for the development of personalities and ideas. And what that means in practice is that we treat the university systems as walled off environments that are discrete from or separate from some of the challenges that we face in the real world, the gritty, messy problems that we encounter in our everyday life. And this is actually deeply problematic for the adoption of technology because it translates into an environment in which we're thinking about AI as a kind of research and development tool, as something that we use in these closed laboratory settings, as opposed to something that's operational, messy, and always embedded in the challenges of a fraught environment or set of environments and contexts. And so this is, I think, one of the things that the academy can learn from the way that industry has to deal with the adoption of artificial intelligence. And I don't mean to suggest that industry always gets this right. In fact, there's countless examples that we talk about at this conference and elsewhere where industry and other institutions in the public sector are failing at meeting the challenges of the moment. But there are some critical lessons that we can learn from the adoption of what I tend to refer to as distinct from this sort of academic research and development idea of AI, and I refer to as something like operational AI, the notion of an AI that's situated in a messy real world that has to deal with all of the contextual challenges and these sort of fundamental characteristics of the technology, which is that it's brittle. It's deeply brittle to the way, because of the way it's developed, because of the way it's constructed, because of the data that goes into it. That brittleness comes out, especially when you meet these edge case scenarios that constitute the real world. So operational AI is more a focus on both the social and technical considerations of embedding the technology in the world. It means both on the kind of social side, the governance principles that need to surround the adoption and use of technology. But I think there's a problem in this discourse more broadly. Most of the way that we're encountering generative AI is through ChatGPT. We have a very limited interface and a very limited mode of engaging with this technology, so we don't see the broader set of applications, and we tend to become fixated on how can ChatGPT or large language models help me with writing, as opposed to how can things like agentic AI help me with carrying out all sorts of agent-oriented tasks. How can this technology be used for things beyond document summary, writing, and so on and so forth. And when you span out to this broader set of applications, you start to see a world emerge of all other sorts of risks and challenges that have implications to operationalizing the technology. So what this means in practice is building in a whole set of, in the literature and in the kind of practical domain of engineering, we tend to refer to as ML ops. It's sort of this general life cycle of building around the challenges and constraints of the technology, starting from understanding the underlying data to building the model and dealing with the challenges associated with a given model, to testing and evaluation, and then all the way through the deployment to the long-term maintenance of the model, recognizing that the brittleness is going to manifest over time, and these types of technologies break down if they're not constantly attended to, monitored, and further developed. And so I think one other manifestation of the way that the academy tends to, or is at risk, again, to be provocative, at risk of getting AI adoption wrong, is that there's a tendency to sort of fixate on or admire certain types of problems. And as someone who's attended CPD and other conferences like this over many, many years, even today, a lot of the discourse and discussion is around problems like bias and discrimination. And I don't mean to minimize those as problems. I think they're real and important problems. But in many ways, these are problems that are actually downstream of these structural issues that I'm talking about, the supporting infrastructure that makes this technology work. And so to put this more concretely, if you don't have a robust system that manages the full data lifecycle, starting from the data quality that goes into feeding a model, all the way through the testing and evaluation that gives you the ability to make sound, assured assessments of the validity of the model outputs in different contexts, according to different permutations. You don't have the ability to look at how the model is performing in varying contexts as the world evolves over time. These systems are bound to break down, and they're going to break down not just in terms of manifesting as bias and discrimination, but all sorts of maybe more fundamental ways. And so this fixation on bias and discrimination, while useful in some flavors of the discourse, actually tends to be more of a distraction as opposed to getting at these infrastructure considerations that I think need to be kind of core to what it means to adopt this technology in a lot of different environments. So I guess there's another point that I wanted to pick up on that I think comes out of some of the remarks that Natalie was making earlier, and maybe we can talk more about this. I think your analogy to the calculator is a striking one, because it points to another broad tendency in the adoption of this technology, which is to see it as a mechanism, a shortcut mechanism to get to outcomes. And I think another flavor of the idea of this pedagogical idea of we learn to think through writing, through engaging with language and actually struggling, is an aspect of a lot of social systems that it's actually the process that matters. So in criminal justice, for example, we know that the notions of justice are less about the numerical outcomes at the end of the day. They're actually about the process that goes into every step of determining that justice has been applied. And so this is another aspect where if you're just adopting these technologies and losing sight of this, you don't see how tools like chain of thought evaluation may focus on a certain class of problems like explainability, but they actually might be useful tools for getting at understanding how the technology use attaches to process considerations that are deeply embedded in the social constructs that we worry about. The final point that I'll make, and then maybe we can have a broader conversation, is we actually need to look beyond ChatGPT. And I'm very concerned as a nominal technologist that so much of this discussion is getting too caught up in generative AI. And this is a critique that applies to the points that I'm making. Even the infrastructure that supports the operational adoption of this technology needs to be ready to evolve, because the frontier of these models may shift, and they may shift dramatically. It may be that a year from now, we're not even talking about transformers or transformer-based technologies. We've moved on to something much different that works in according to entirely different mechanisms. And so getting too caught up both in the specific issues around generative AI use, but also the specific remedies of generative AI use in the academic and the broader setting, may actually lead us to a pathway where we have sunken costs in things that we struggle to actually move away from and adapt to the changing world. So I would just add that as a final point of caution as we carry forward the thinking on AI in academic.
Thank you so much. That was couldn't agree more about the last part. Okay, I want to throw some things that I want you to discuss and give me your opinion. Then we will open up for discussion. So my first point is, how disruptive is this? I mean, maybe some people view generative AI still as a hype, or at least that it's some sort of a hype. A lot of people acknowledge that it has a lot of benefits, but some people say that most people might overestimate what generative AI can actually do. Think of the future of work, for example. So some people say, 3, 5 years from now, no one's going to work, or most of us not going to work. A lot of people, other people say it's not that simple. So I would love to hear your take on that, and it could depend on any industry that you want to take upon. We can start from there. Yeah. Yes.
So me to kick off?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah. Initial reactions. I think we're really still in kind of peak hype around generative AI, and some of the wind is bound to deflate. We do definitely see areas of significant adoption and use and gains, but I think when people hear the term disruption, they think of kind of radical paradigmatic transformation, and I don't think that's happening, at least not broadly. And I don't think that's the reasonable expectation. I think we should expect that the results are going to be very even, and there's going to be retrenchment. I mean, even recently, we've seen companies that have made massive workforce shifts towards chatbots in lieu of service agents are already stepping back and acknowledging that the chatbots maybe cover 80% of the kind of common use cases, but actually where the biggest risk to the company is in the high-touch interactions that require a lot of ability to adapt and deal with really tricky problems that you can't interpolate with a large language model. So even in the kind of the areas that seem most promising, there's already a pullback, and I think we should expect that uneven lurching motion towards this technology gaining ground. It certainly is going, I think we're going to see efficiency gains across the board, but I think that motion translates into a lot of opportunity to figure things out and figure out where we can set the right controls in place to adopt responsibly.
And I think there's actually an even more subtle point to what you were saying, namely that the technology is in a way overhyped, but people are using it regardless. And that, I think, is a dangerous combination. I mean, like, I work in Germany, right? Like, part of the role of the company, the startup that I work for, is to try and get German companies to adopt digital tools more, which if you live in Germany, know it's like the work that's important to do, right? But the bar is very low. And what I witness a lot is that people want to jump ahead and use AI systems, be it ChatGPT or other AI systems, without actually ensuring that they have the necessary underlying infrastructure in terms of data, tools, human resources, right? Like the skills you need to develop and deploy those AI tools effectively and ethically, that infrastructure simply does not yet exist. And still people jump ahead and try to use these tools with all the disappointment at best that might come out of it, right? There might be other repercussions that flow from the fact that tools are used in ways that might not be appropriate and where you don't actually have the data or like the tools or the skills necessary to do so. Interestingly enough, in the AI Act as well, there is obviously now this requirement of AI literacy, which will also apply to universities, right? Universities as institutions have an obligation to ensure that the people using AI systems on their behalf have a sufficient level of AI literacy in the sense of being able to use AI systems in an informed manner and to be aware of the opportunities, risks, and possible harms. I'd be curious to know, like, are there AI literacy trainings for university professors at the institutions that you work at?
Yeah, we do that internally.
Yeah.
I mean, I do that in our
Yeah.
faculty.
Yeah. So you took it on you.
But we do that for our students, and beginning next year, it's going to be a compulsory course, basically, that they have to take all years, all degrees. You want to also, Jen?
So I definitely echo Paula's sentiment that even though it's overhyped and it doesn't yet seem to function the way we think it should function, my sense is that a lot of entities are nevertheless jumping on it. Also out of including universities, including my own university, also out of a sense of wanting to be seen as modern and going along with the time and making sure you adapt to change. There is a kind of a stigma of being left behind, of being like too traditional, too untechnological. We need to prepare our students for the future, so we need to embrace it. But there is no real plan behind the embracing, right? It's really just kind of a almost blind adoption. I see this also in governments. So the question is no longer, what are the problems that we need to solve? and what tools should we use for that. But I have civil servants telling me that their bosses ask them, what can we do with generative AI? Right? What kind of things could we, how can we implement it rather than first analyzing what they could possibly need it for? Because they too want to be able to tell their citizens we're modern, we're efficient, we're going on with our time, we're using the technology. And now it's true that not all jobs are focused on writing. Right, because then of course there's so many jobs which is more manual, where the whole ChatGPT or writing thing is not really a hype right now, and the whole point I made about critical thinking is also perhaps less of a red flag there. At the same time, when it's in academia, it's again par excellence the case where writing is important. I think the technology doesn't agree with me. And whenever I go speak about this, in the beginning, I would always ask people in the room, by raise of hand, how many of you using ChatGPT? In the beginning, it was like a handful of people. But now, if I just, do this, how many of you have been using ChatGPT or another AI tool by raise of hand? Yeah. Yeah, so this is the result that I see more often, that the minority is not using it and the majority is. And of course, the consequence is not that we should all not be using it, but it's not yet performing what it actually should be, if it ever will. The risks are there, and entities are investing in it. And one of the concerns I have as well is the path dependencies after you've invested in it. So you can have kind of sunken costs. Once you put a lot of money and effort into the adoption of a tool, even if it doesn't work well, especially as a government, you want to save face. And so it might be easier to just keep using it for whatever task rather than just doing completely away with it.
Yes. But the subsequent question I would ask the audience is, how many people here use AI daily? How many people use AI for their jobs? Okay, that's interesting. I have a subsequent question because we're talking about academia, and I mean, most of the things that I used to hear, and I still hear a lot, and I think this goes very deeply into research and into teaching as well, is the ethical problems. Okay, so the plagiarism on the table. So is that how? I'm not talking legally wise. I'm talking just ethically wise. So you talked a lot about non-native speakers. For me, it's an amazing tool. I'm not an English native speaker. For me, it's an amazing tool. I used to have to use editors whenever I had to submit a law review or a book. I don't have to do that anymore. I have Claude. Sorry, I'm more of a fan of Claude than ChatGPT, in writing at least. I use Claude, and every paragraph that I'll write, I will always run through Claude. I'm not telling Claude, write me a paragraph about whatever, intellectual property. It doesn't work. It can write it, but it won't be anything that is of value for a scholar, at least for me. But it's a great tool for refining, and yes, it does complete some sentences, maybe it changes a bit. I'll run through it. It does delegate some of the thinking, maybe, but the question is, where do we draw the line between plagiarism, non-plagiarism, ethical, non-ethical, etc. Whoever wants to take it.
I'll give an oddball response as, again, the industry representative. My reaction, I have strong ethical concerns, but I also have aesthetic concerns, and this may be counterintuitive as the corporate guy. One of the things that I find frustrating about working in industry is we are subject to, and this is a problem for academia as well, but we're subject to this sort of decay into corporate pablum. It's the terminology, the jargon of synergies and 0 1, all of that nonsense gets really tedious for me. And so there's something about the constant attempt to at least rejuvenate language, and the extent to which ChatGPT or some other generative AI tool becomes a shortcut for me to get to a result, that's really fatiguing for me in the long run. Maybe it helps me in the short term, but I think it produces a sense of, God, I have to write another awful email. And there's no joy in trying to experiment with the language and try to say something creative, because there's politics within organizations, and part of the politics is playing with language and getting people to be energized by an idea. And so that's a real risk in the industry. And again, this goes back to the point of if we think of academia and the university systems as preparing the next generation of workers, do we want these workers to enter industry with this sort of dull sense of a chat GPT smoothed over language, or do we want to have them some sense of excitement of the value and import that we place in the use of language?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. Yeah, so I think when it comes to more ethical questions, I think a first question that we can also ask is it ethical to use these kind of systems in the first place, knowing that under many conceptions, they are most likely have been created by breaching copyright laws and by breaching privacy laws.
This is beyond IP.
It's beyond IP, but ethically, should we? To which extent should we be all collectively using tools that most likely, I'll put it this way, have been created by infringing legislation, right? So that's perhaps a first question, and then. My concern when I use ChatGPT or another tool as an editor, and it makes my kind of not really well thought sentence, because whatever, I'm gonna have it edited anyway, in the system when it makes it pretty, I do always wonder, is the way in which this beautiful sentence is now formulated maybe like a copy paste from someone else's paper? And what if I then use it because I think it's prettier like this, and someone, on X tells me, Natalie Smuha has been using exactly my sentence, and I've never heard of that person, I never read that paper, but it is a possibility. So I am very cautious about that, even though I understand how useful it is. To the aesthetics, I also find this sense of we seem to all be, the text that comes out of it is always kind of similar in style, which is handy for professors because you can figure out whether a student used it or not, even in drafting their emails. But it also means that we're all starting to use the same jargon, the same, so many titles of papers I see today start with navigating this or that. That's like standard, for me, ChatGPT suggestions. And then maybe finally, because it's linked with ethics, is the underlying business model of academia. Because at the end of the day, in lots of countries, and Belgium and the Netherlands, for instance, are no exception, as an academic, it's not just that you're supposed to teach, you're also really supposed to produce. It's not just engaging in critical thinking, but it's really producing, having output. Output to get to your tenure goals, output to get to your next promotion. And in a way, these tools further stimulate this threshold. They make you be able to reach your KPIs faster, because we're speaking of KPIs now, also in academia, which means that if you're not using it, you're also being left behind. You're not fully fulfilling your duties, because all the others are producing content much faster and much better and much more efficiently. So there's a perversion in the underlying business model of academia, which is not technology related, but the technology might reinforce the problematic tendency of that business model.
I think that's a very good point about the business model or the output expectancy of scholars, for example, because everything, I mean, I have a lot of PhDs, for example, which I'm not sure if it does cut and save a lot of time, and maybe you have to have 3 law reviews or peer reviews published to get a PhD in my university. So maybe if it used to take 4 or 5 years, maybe it'll take a year now. I'm not sure, and I don't know what will happen to scholarship in general if it will become. And I'm not talking about current generative AI. I'm talking about the advancements which are likely to happen in, let's say, 2-3 years from now, when these models, and I have experimented with a lot of them in writing. Some of them are targeted. Stanford had their own Storm software that they tried to generate articles. It didn't work very well, to my opinion. But these models, which I've experimented since Chat 3.5, had gotten a lot better in writing when you know what you're doing, basically. About whether or not it will get a sentence which you basically took from another paper. So there is some controversy there right now. So there was just a paper released 2 days ago about whether or not it spits out specific parts of other books. It shouldn't, as the LLM, like in the statistical probability that it works on, it shouldn't generally, unless there's not enough training data, and then it only learned from one book, for example, then it might do so. But there might be, I would say that from the counter argument would be, we will likely have AI tools that will check and recheck those things now better, and to see, like Perplexity does, or ChatGPT does as well right now, to recheck and see if whether or not there's plagiarism and whether or not it's cited again. But I don't know. Who knows where it goes? I do want to open it up a bit to see for questions from the audience, because we have time. So yes, please.
Hello. Before anything, thank you so much for the panel. Truly inspiring. I'm Professor Felipe Medon from FGV Rio Law Brazil, and I'm involved with AI in education for two separate universities. At Columbia Law School, I'm in a project called AI in the Future of Work, and we have a task force which is exactly AI in education. And we are currently working on the discussion of what competencies and skills are both being lost and acquired by the use of AI in education. And at FGV, I'm coordinating a research on how the multi-stakeholders in the legal professions perceive the use of AI, which is something important for us to decide on what we should act. I would like just to get back before asking with a comment that we've been realizing by teaching that our students, they don't read anymore. We use the Socratic method in our university, and it's very interesting that a lot of students, they have approached me, and I teach students from 16 years old to 20 mostly, and a couple of them have approached me at the beginning of this semester saying that Google's Notebook LM is their best friend right now. They are using it to record what professors are saying in class. So they make a summarization of what the professor has said in class, and they study based on that summary. So students don't write anymore, and ultimately, as it has been said, they don't think anymore. But the question is, what are we doing to circumvent this problem? How can we tackle? Because at the same time, we are thinking about making students do more things in class, because there we have control. But at the same time, we're making them away from the tools that they are required to use. So it's very hard to strike a balance between how we do that. So we need to be creative. And my question would be, considering that we are at a law journal committee, if a student asks, or somebody who's submitting a paper, a Gen AI tool to rewrite and improve his or her paper, is it ethical, fair? And I'm not talking about translating into English, but speaking in your own language. Should he be transparent about it? Or should we try to create another category of people who are submitting their papers by using AI, and that is something that we should evaluate differently? Because it is also a matter of standardization of academia. As Natalie said, the jargons are going to be the same, and as being part of some law reviews, it is clear that words like navigating are becoming even more common these days. Thank you.
Maybe like one immediate reaction to that. There's a saying that I like, that I use a lot sort of in my personal and professional life, which goes, if you don't like something, change it. If you cannot change it, change your attitude. And I think we always need to think about, like, on what side of that sentence we are. When it comes to the use of AI in academia on both the student and the professor side, I don't think we're going to be able to change that anymore, right? It's just part of the reality, whether the underlying training was ethical or not. Like, these tools are out there, we're not going to be able to put them back in the box anymore. Mm-hmm. The question is, if we cannot change that anymore, how do we change the way we handle that? And if, for instance, the situation is such that students now just write their papers with AI, they basically just like try to learn from summaries that AI has generated as well. Maybe the responsibility is on the university side to rethink the way they assess knowledge and the way they convey knowledge as well. And maybe also the extent to which they prioritize teaching. Thinking back about my own time in academia, most of my colleagues didn't enjoy teaching, right? That was like a thing that distracted from your actual work, the output that gets you to your tenure track position. But there is actually a responsibility on educators to put work into teaching. And maybe there's a future here as well where there's a renewed appreciation of the sort of like in-person interaction that you have in the classroom. I remember having interactions that also changed me, right? Where, you know, most of the time they're a little bored in the classroom, but every once in a while you say something, you see somebody having like a little spark. And I found that extremely gratifying. And I think going to a world in which also like the business of academia sort of like fosters these kinds of interactions, you know, engaging in the creative work of thinking about like, how can you actually evaluate critical thinking, knowledge, assuming that all the rest will be based on summaries, etc. Like what kind of conversations can you have in person in the classroom? How can you evaluate those in a way that fosters people that will be able to engage critically in a democratic environment? I think that's really where we need to be going. But I say this easily, it's not easily done.
Thank you very much. My name is Cornelia Kutter, and I have just recently, at least part-time, also gone into academia and teaching AI governance in the US. So much of what you said, Paula, actually was sort of taking my questions out, because both the literacy, so basically you need, and you need not only literacy, it's not about only teaching about the the ethical issues, but actually really the computer science issues and the engagement in class. So it's troubling. It's even so like, okay, what do I actually teach? How much do I use AI to prepare my classes? The piece and the learning is the reading has been the constant complaint. We had like great lists of reading material, and they come back and say, it's way too much, way too much. So it's all like, for me, obviously learning, because I'm new to that. What I missed a little bit is sort of the critical thinking. I think that is a little bit what you're leaning towards to as well. So how do we encourage the critical thinking that I think was the underlying theme that Natalie had for what's going to get missing over time with using AI. So this was more commenting, sorry. Great panel. My question is a more, it goes a little bit into a different area, which is disabilities. In particular, disabilities around cognitive capabilities that have hindered a large amount of people actually not going into academia, and how AI can be actively now used to get these people in the tent and be more inclusive. And I'm thinking about, for example, let's just start with people that have dyslexia, that had not been able to actually do these careers due to their inability to pick up things in the same speed as others. So is there something that because that's also part of like, let's use these technologies for the force of good. So is there any thinking around that as well?
Maybe just anecdotally, I recently read an article a couple of weeks ago, I think it was in the New Yorker as well, about these transcripts created by AI being exceptionally helpful for people who have hearing disabilities, because it enables you basically to participate in conversations much more actively than you would otherwise, because you can sort of like, there are these glasses where you can like read what people are saying like while they're speaking. So I do think there are very sort of like area-specific applications of AI that could be enormously useful in like bringing these people back into the conversation. So I agree with you that a lot more research should be put in these very sort of like applied specific aspects of AI where to which AI also lends itself, right? Like basically copying what somebody is saying in real time.
Yes.
Thank you so much for organizing this. Much needed. So super interesting. I think we should maybe make a distinction between editing something, content, and creating something. And for creating something or for editing something, for example, I have dyslexia, I have ADHD, and it's been very hard for me to create something that looks perfect. And I always had like many criticism from my supervisors because how can't you see this? Like you're writing it wrong. And I started to use Grammarly, and there was no problem, right? Like until we had the ChatGPT, because Grammarly is editing you, like showing your mistakes. So I think, I mean, my opinion is that this is not the problem here, but the problem is the creativity. And I'm really curious about, especially what Nathalie Smua thinks about the creativity, because when I think about, as a legal scholar, I cannot frame it as even as an ethical value, but maybe we can call it a human value that is now threatened by generative AI. And as you said, for example, titles like navigating that starts, I don't know, like it highlights or something like this, like very almost like a template sentences are coming up, but these are already based on other written work out there. So that's another problem, again, beyond IP. But one problem is that we are kind of stuck in a feedback loop or creativity loop or non-creativity loop. And there are two scenarios. One, maybe the human creation, the originality will become something really valuable, or we will just stuck in here, or we will just maybe forget or become less creative. So I was wondering what you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, very good question, and definitely not an easy question. So maybe the first thing to say is that I do believe that tools like Grammarly are still different than tools like ChatGPT, also because of the capabilities of the tool, right? So if there's only so much a tool can do, you're also going to be less tempted to delegate ever more to the tool. So it does make a difference. I do want to say, though, I understand it's difficult to get to the perfect sentence, and it's not a disability, but not having English as your native language can also be seen as a disability in that sense, right? It's difficult to get to perfect. The underlying problem here is also just the fact that we're all pushed towards perfect English sentences, even though I also know journals that accept papers that are not perfectly written in English, because that's something you can edit after the paper was actually accepted, right? And that's how people who are not native English speakers but still write substantively well and structured have a chance at publishing. So I think this is something we need to push back against, even more perhaps, or similarly than technology. I do think the line with tools like ChatGPT, the lines between editing and creating become a bit blurred because they're able to do both. So this is where I see a bit of an issue. And as to creativity, there's so many ways in which we can define creativity, right? And there are many discussions I've had also with technology experts saying, yes, but if we leave, tools like ChatGPT behind, when we're creating something new, we all have ideas in our mind that come from things we read, things we saw. So we're always building on something else. That is true. And so being creative and throwing something new out there, you can ask the philosophical question, is anything really fully new? But then I think we also need to ask the question, what is it for? Because you can check the standard of whether your output is creative vis-a-vis all the other people in the world. And if I see it, all the other content in the world, what I say might not be that creative or that novel. I don't know. I haven't read everyone out there. But if I see what I produce vis-a-vis the Natalie of 5 years ago, I can see a progress. And I think this is what learning is about. This is what critical thinking is about. It's not just about comparing whatever I put out there with everyone there who maybe has other tools or much more expertise than me. It's how I do as an individual, not just as an academic, but as an individual human being. And I think this is something we really need to preserve, and that risks getting lost because of this standard that is being pushed on us of being perfect or being super creative or original, because that's when we want to make use of these tools to get shortcuts.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Responsiveness for the Arts and I would like to ask Mr. Bowman. You mentioned something about maintenance and how it's going to be one of the serious challenges generative AI is going to have to tackle with. Sometimes in discussions, it has come up whether the massive production of material through LLMs is going to return us maintaining material that is being used for keep training the same models in a couple of years, and whether this is a vicious cycle which inevitably is going to lead to the deterioration of the models themselves, and whether this is avoidable or not in the end. I'm saying this because it comes down to questioning whether academia is actually one considerable contributing factor to the demise of the models because of the overuse that is happening. Do you think there is any substance in this sequence of thinking, or it's just?
No, I think it's a real risk and identified concern within the model development community that model developers has kind of exhausted all of the available corpus of data that they can use to train new models or next frontier versions of models. And so we're at this point where we're proliferating more information that's kind of garbage that's going to feed the next generation, and maybe that has even more of a smoothing function where we just revert to more text that's kind of warmed over platitudes and or just abject misinformation or disinformation that's been generated by large language models that have gone off the rail. There's a real problem. I think there's approaches to addressing this, but I think it's something that definitely affects the way that model developers are thinking about this. In my mind, this is just another symptom of maybe generative AI maybe approaching some kind of dead end or diminishing return asymptote, where we're only going to continue to eke out additional gains, not through building bigger and bigger models with more and more parameters, but most of the gains that we're seeing are through the surrounding infrastructure. It's the prompt engineering, it's the integration of ground truth data, of other kind of steering concepts that help align the technology with results that we viewed as being ethical or useful or both. And that seems to be a direction of more of the necessary innovation for making these models work. And in fact, a lot of the additional development is going into not bigger large language models with more training data, but different modes, multimodal applications that mix language, auditory, and images, and stitch all of that together. That may be where more of the innovation happens. But going back to one of the points that I made earlier, it may just be that we're approaching kind of a dead end for the use of these technologies. And if we think about the way that we learn on sparse information, we carry out some form of abductive inference, where we don't have to read all of the information in the world. We kind of build hypotheses based on limited information. That may be more indicative of where the next version of artificial intelligence can make meaningful developments. And the real risk here is that there's so much concentration on this particular class of machine learning that if you believe in AGI as something that's on the horizon, I personally am very skeptical. But if you believe that that's the direction that industry should be trending in, industry actually may be pushing itself towards a kind of AI winter gloom scenario where we're going to be sorely disappointed on the results of this particular technology, and we're losing pathways for more interesting innovations.
So as an anecdote, to just close the panel on the navigating aspects of the use of ChatGPT. So I remember a year ago, it was, if you find the word delve, I delved into that was ChatGPT, obviously. People don't use that often. Maybe they do because it's a statistical method, but that was a good way to find ChatGPT. And I can tell you that for my students, I think it's a cat and mouse game to catch who uses it and to what extent. And what I'll often do, I'll just use prompt injection into their take-home exams. Basically, I'll insert something that they won't see in the document, telling ChatGPT or Claude, if the student just asked for an answer here, please spit out this theory, which I just made up. And a lot of students do, unfortunately. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the talk.